Okay. Hello everyone. My name is Jingtong Zhu, and thanks for coming to the talk. And it really is a shame that I couldn't make it to the conference in person due to my flight being cancelled very last minute. But I hope you will enjoy the talk regardless. And I know that it's probably going to be the very last talk of the entire event. So again, thank you for coming here. So the topic I will share with you today is succeeding on Steam in China in 2024. So the talk itself will be around 40 minutes, and at the end, we're also going to have around 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. And before we begin, I want to briefly introduce myself. So I am currently an associate producer at the publisher Tinyboat, and previously I also worked for a publisher in China. So I have around 4 years of experience in publishing, and I have participated in the release of more than a dozen games on different platforms. So I hope I will use my experience from the trenches to provide some practical suggestions for developers, especially indie devs, as well as publishers. So before I start, I would like to briefly introduce why I think the Chinese market is worth paying attention to. And here I want to do a quick survey. Can you please raise your hands if you have not heard of at least one of the games that I'm showing here? I actually cannot see if you raised your hands, but I'm gonna make a very wide guess that you probably haven't heard of some of the games.
Mm.
So these four games are all indie games made by very small teams, but one thing they have in common is that they all sold over 1 million copies on Steam alone, and majority of the sales come from China. And the reason I want to show these games is to show that the Chinese market alone has the potential to bring a lot of success to your game on Steam. And I also have two additional data sources to prove my point. So a survey by Statista in October 2023 showed that about 1/3 of Steam users use simplified Chinese. And this official Steam hardware survey from last month shows that simplified Chinese is now the most used language on Steam. So what this means is that there are around 36 million active users of Steam using Chinese right now. And players who use simplified Chinese are mostly from one country, that is China. So I would say that it's pretty safe to assume that China is very much the single largest market for Steam games in 2024. And because of how big the Chinese market is, I see that in recent years, many international games hope to break into the Chinese market as well. However, I think that I found that in practice, promoting games to Chinese players is very difficult. And I personally think that that there are two main obstacles. The first one is language barrier. So although most young people in China can speak some Chinese, can speak some English, most people still prefer using their native language when it comes to entertainment and media consumption. Another big obstacle is social media barrier. You may have heard that global social media platforms like YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch, etc., are banned in China. Although it's still possible to access these platforms with a VPN, most people still prefer using China's local social media platforms. So on top of language barrier, it's also extremely difficult to register an account on these platforms if you're a foreigner. So I would say that it's almost impossible for international developers to use these Chinese platforms to communicate directly with their audience. And nowadays, most international games would post the trailers and other promotional content in English, and by default, they would post these, for example, trailers and social posts on global platforms, like I mentioned just now. So with both language barrier and social media barrier, it's extremely difficult for the global gaming content to reach Chinese players effectively. So why do I highly recommend using Steam to promote your games to Chinese players? This is because Steam is not just the platform to buy games, but also one of the main channels for Chinese players to discover games and keeping up with gaming news. And one of our games conducted a survey on Chinese player a while ago. So this survey showed that Steam is the most commonly used source for receiving game information. And another point that I didn't show on the slide here is that for Chinese players, they can access the Steam storefront without a VPN. And also the Steam UI itself is also really well localized. So as a global platform, Steam removes its both obstacles that I mentioned earlier, which makes it a very ideal channel for promoting games. So after the introduction just now, you might want to ask, although the Chinese market is really huge, how can I predict whether my game will be popular with Chinese players? So in the next part, I will introduce two ways to evaluate your game's potential in China. So the first one is Chinese players' general preference. Uh, I honestly did not find enough data to support my points, but so majority of the following content come from my experience at work, and long hours every day that I spend on Steam browsing everything. So here we go. So in terms of genres, Chinese players prefer simulator games, management games, live sims, tycoon games, and also farming games, which I forgot to list here. And they also really like card games, including the kind of deck building card battlers. And also really like city builders and base builders, also as well as auto battler games. So here I listed some genres that are considered to be quite niche in the Chinese market, which are sports, action and fighting games, and racing games. So if your game belongs to one of these genres, then I would say that it would be more challenging to make your game popular with the Chinese audience. And moving on to features. So in terms of features, they really like roguelike games and games with Asia cultural elements. So the best example here are Sifu, which is made by a French studio, and Warlord: The Last Dynasty, which is made by a Japanese studio. So both of these games reference heavily the Chinese culture or history, so they are all very popular with the Chinese audience. And they also Chinese players also really like anime games, also games with co-op gameplay. So when it comes to pricing, I must say that it's a very complicated issue, so I probably won't be able to dig too deep into this at our talk now. I can only give you a relatively simple and straightforward conclusion here. So if your game identify as an indie game, then I would suggest maybe pricing it under 80 Chinese yuan, which is approximately the 20 USD Steam default regional price. So Chinese players are generally very price sensitive. So if you price your game too high, or if it's over the three-digit mark, it's very likely to affect sales and conversion rates. And this is especially true for indie games. So the rule of thumb here, I would say, is to use Steam's default regional pricing setup since it's the proven price point for many regions. And I would also like to show a negative example. So this is the regional pricing chart of an indie game released under famous IP a couple of months ago. I probably won't be able to tell you which game it is, but you can make a wide guess. So as you can see, the base price of the game is $25, but almost all regional prices are manually adjusted to be as close to the base price as possible. So in terms of the Chinese price, you can see that it's 185 Chinese yuan. But bear in mind that this is a 10-hour long indie game, and its regional price in China is almost as expensive as Helldivers 2. So even though the game has a huge IP, it didn't really perform that well in China, and it only sold around 5% of copies in China, although the studio's previous games have been much more popular in China. So, again, please don't do this. Um, when in doubt, just use Steam's recommended default regional pricing options. And in addition to the more general preferences, I would also like to recommend another way to measure Chinese players' interest in games. So here I want to show you my favorite analytical tool of all time, which is Steam Scout, and it's created by Toge Productions. With this tool, you can see the language breakdown of Steam reviews of any released game. So this means that you can use this tool to check the numbers of Chinese reviews of your competitors. I have to say that I like this tool so much that checking the language breakdown of random games is almost my hobby. So from doing that, I want to share a very interesting data that I got from doing this. So for China, the ratio of Steam ratings in simplified Chinese is the same as the sales. And what I mean by this is that, for example, in this screenshot, around 5% of the reviews come from China. So this means that around 5% of the game sales come from China. So let me provide you with a reference baseline. I think that if a game that is not made by a Chinese studio sells over 20% of copies in China, then I would say that this game does pretty well in the Chinese market. So if you find that the proportion of Chinese Steam reviews of your competitor games is generally quite high, then it probably means that your game is likely to be pretty popular with Chinese players. And recently, Steam Scout also released a new feature. So now you can use the tool to export all Steam reviews by language in a CSV format. So you can actually use the tool to analyze player sentiment in different regions. So, anyways, this is my favorite business analytical tool ever, and I can't recommend it enough. And now let's take a look at the biggest indie hits on Steam so far this year. So as you can see, almost all these games meet my 20% standard that indicates success in the Chinese market. So apparently these games are all very different in terms of genres and visual style, but they all have something that Chinese players like. So in terms of genres, three of these games are somewhat roguelike, and two of them are deck building games. And Power World is a co-op friendly base building game, which is something that Chinese players like a lot. And in terms of pricing, all of these games, except for Power World, are priced under 100 Chinese yuan. And with Power World's 10% launch discount, it also kind of fits into this criteria as well. So after understanding how important the Chinese market is to you, I will then move on to Steam's two native features, which is Steam Store and Steam Community. And I'm going to introduce some actionable ways to optimize your presence on Steam. Before introducing the detailed breakdown of Steam assets, I would like to emphasize the importance of localizing your actual game. So here I want to use two examples to prove my point. And let's begin with Lethal Company. So Lethal Company is one of the biggest indie hits of 2023, and so far the game only supports English. And uh, let's take a look at the game's reviews. So in December 2023, the game had nearly 120,000 reviews. And when I used the Steam Scout tool that we just mentioned, I found that English reviews account for nearly 80%. So uh, I would like you to guess how many simplified Chinese reviews it has. Okay, let me review the answer. It only had 0.5% back in December. So a couple months later, which is in April, the game reviews have tripled. But the game still only supports English. So with that in mind, it's not super surprising that the game still only has around 3% of simplified Chinese reviews, although you can see that the number increased quite a lot during the period. So this, in my opinion, is quite shocking because considering the popularity of the game. Because in most cases, the Chinese reviews of games that has Chinese localization is generally around 10 to 15%. And for the world's most popular games like Lethal Company, this number is often much higher. That is to say, because Lethal Company does not have Chinese localization, it probably missed out on a quarter of Steam users. So another more recent and somewhat similar example is content warning. So this game just released at the beginning of April, and I read on their official Steam account that they already sold over 1 million copies, which is really impressive. So interestingly, the game also only supports English, and as a result, it only has 5% of Chinese Steam reviews. And this number already includes the reviews from when the game was free on Steam on April the 1st. And of course, I'm not really using these examples to say that the developers did not do a good job, because I would say that realistically, vast majority of the games that we work on in our entire careers might not be as successful as Lethal Company or Content Warning. But my point here is to show that uh, what kind of negative impact it will have if the game does not have Chinese localization. Now let's quickly throw back to these four indie hits that I talked about earlier. One other thing that they have in common is that, uh, well, you might have guessed it, they all have Chinese localization. So from these games, Balatros case is a little bit more unique because when it first launched in February, the Chinese localization was only available in the beta branch. And if you launch the game right at the beginning, it was in English by default. So this apparently did have some negative impact on the sales in China. But then the developers quickly released a patch including Chinese localization along with other languages just in a few weeks. And the sales in China still caught up. So I would say that the lesson here is that although it's ideal to have localization at the launch, if you couldn't do it, it's still never too late to catch up later. And next, I would like to explain that even if the game itself does support Chinese, the localization of your Steam store assets will still affect visibility and conversion. So first of all, using localized assets can quickly send a message that the, our game supports Chinese localization, which definitely has a positive influence on players' wish list and purchase decision-making process. So for example, on the left screenshot, I'm highlighting the games with localized logos and localized titles. So these games definitely stand out from the other ones on this list. And on the right-hand side, you can see that the cell asset used by Metal Hellsinger was translated into Chinese with the message of new updates out now, which is definitely more eye-catching than other assets next to it, which I imagined helped the conversion of the game as well. So next, I will talk about which Steam assets I recommend localizing. So I'm going to use the store page of a game that we launched last year, Black Skylands, As an example. So let's start with the first tier of assets, which I think are must-haves in terms of localization. And the first one from the highest tier is game name. So there is a very common mistake here. Many games do have their names translated in the descriptions, but sometimes I see that they don't really sync the localized title on the store page title that I'm highlighting here. And not syncing your titles will have a negative impact on search engine results and players' perception of the brand's identity. And then I would definitely suggest localizing the short and long description, which I would say that most games do manage to localize. So the third one is the type of assets that I call graphic assets with important information. So for example, like the poster for pre-order bonus, like the one I'm showing here from Punch Club 2, as well as information on DLC launches, update roadmap, etc. So if this kind of assets are not localized, Chinese players are very likely to just skip it altogether. So moving on to the second tier of assets that I recommend localization. These are the kind of assets that are difficult to produce and maybe take more resources, but if you manage to do so, they can have high returns. So the first one is trailers with voiceover or call to action information. So the type of information in these trailers is often really important. Usually, it should be something like important gameplay mechanics or some important marketing messages like release day announcement or playtest. So if trailer like this don't have subtitles or translations, it will be very difficult for players to pick up. So the next thing is the game logo. If you do manage to localize the game logo, you want to make sure that all Steam capsules use your localized game logo because capsules have more visibility on Steam than the text version. So I would say that these have an even greater impact on conversion. And here is a summary of the priority of localizing Steam assets. So for the third tier, you can also consider localizing the screenshots and GIFs and your social media banners. But I would say that these are nice to have, but they don't have as much impact as the first two tiers. So feel free to take a picture if you need it. I will also use this time to take a quick water break. Okay, moving on. So with everything that I just mentioned, I definitely understand from my everyday work experience of how challenging it is in practice to cover every single thing, even at a relatively big publisher like TinyBuild. So here I want to add some more realistic suggestions for developers with limited resources. So the first one is please prioritize your resources and please prioritize localizing the game itself above anything else. So basically, just do what you can, and it's never too late to update your game or assets later. And I definitely recommend talking to a localization professional first, just to get an idea of your options. And secondly, please be mindful about machine translation. So I would say that using machine translation on your Steam assets and copy might be better than having no translation at all. But I would suggest being more transparent about this so that players can understand the context better. However, I'm definitely against using machine translation for the entire game because basically the risk is just too high. And I saw some examples of this turning into an absolute disaster. So in any case, while machine translation can be a helpful temporary alternative, just please be mindful about using it. And finally, I would say that your community can help you with coming up with some ideas for localization, such as with game titles, translation of character names, or ideas for localized game logo design. And this could also be a really cool way to engage with your audience as well. But I don't think it's a great idea to depend on your community to translate your entire game, since obviously it impacts the gameplay experience so much. And honestly, I don't think it's a very ethical way to do it. Um, so please consider crediting and compensating your community for their help and labor. And next, I would like to share with you some ideas to use Steam community as a platform to better reach and communicate with your Chinese audience. I will also include some community management ideas beyond Steam. So as you know, I spend an unhealthy amount of time on Steam Scouts every day. So from doing that, I noticed a very interesting and a little bit concerning pattern, which is Chinese players are more likely to leave negative reviews on Steam, as you can see from these four random games here. I used to think that it's simply because we Chinese people maybe were just born more toxic, but now with more experience and interacting with natural players, I realized that there are definitely much deeper reasons to this. So first of all, due to the language and social media barrier that I just mentioned, without localized assets and localized news, it's very difficult for Chinese players to get a realistic and up-to-date understanding of the status of a game, which can lead to them having inconsistent expectations. And secondly, Chinese players couldn't really use popular platforms like Discord or Reddit to where they could communicate with the devs directly and provide their feedback. So the problem is even more obvious after the launch because you will notice that many Chinese players leave negative reviews just to complain about one specific bug. However, although these both of these reasons are pretty difficult to deal with, we all understand how much impact the Steam review score has on the conversion and sales in the global market. So thankfully, I think these obstacles can be avoided by laying a good foundation beforehand. I will try to explain my points in two phases, which is before the launch and after the launch. So before the launch, if possible, would highly suggest translating your Steam news because Steam News is not just a very good channel to introduce the latest updates of the game. It also has really good visibility placements in the Steam client itself, as well as on the store page. So if your resources are limited, as most of ours do, please at least consider translating the more important bits. So, for example, like the game's release date, pre-order information, or any major updates. So otherwise, at least for Chinese players, if the news are just in English or just in one language, it's almost certain that no one is going to read it. Trust me, because I say this from my experience. So on the screen right now, I'm showing two Steam News Center of two games. So on the left, Last Train Home only has news posts in English, and Chance of Senna on the right has pretty complete localization for its important news like launch trailer and gameplay overview, and the contract is quite straightforward. So in terms of sales, Last Train Home has approximately 9% of sales from China, and for Chance of Senna, it got approximately 20%, which meets my standards of success mentioned earlier. But apparently, the sales of the game depends on lots of factors like genres, pricing, quality, marketing, etc. So this is obviously just for reference. And next, I would like to briefly talk about playtesting before the launch. So I mentioned that after the launch, it's often very difficult for Chinese players to provide feedback to the developers, and they also tend to leave negative reviews after the launch because the game does not meet their expectations. So I think that to avoid this, it's best to allow players from as many countries as possible to participate in your playtest before the launch. This will help you prepare for the opinions of players in different countries, but also allow them to get a more reasonable expectation of the game. So I recommend using the Steam native playtest feature because players do not need to use any third-party platforms to register for the playtest, which is very accessible for players everywhere, including China. And in addition, if you want to do surveys for your game, it's also a good idea to consider whether players from all countries can participate in the survey without any barriers. So our game, Streets of Rogue, has a button in the Chinese main menu of the game, so players can click on this button to get to the survey directly, which makes the process much easier and more accessible for them. So after the launch, no matter how big or small the game is, players will 100% for sure encounter some kind of bugs or other top problems. But just like I mentioned now, Chinese players couldn't really use popular channels like Discord to send feedback and get support from the devs. So I would suggest providing feedback channel that can be accessed without using VPN. So here are two options for your reference. So for Street to Rogue, the game has a built-in window for submitting feedback, and players can just send questions or suggestions to the developers without exiting the game. And on the right, I'm showing an example from Punch Up 2. So for this game, we noticed that after the launch, Chinese players left quite a lot of negative reviews due to specific bugs. So we started a Chinese specific bug feedback thread on the game's Steam forum, and we made sure that the post has enough visibility. So we put the link of the post at the top of the description on the Steam store page. And thankfully, this quickly became a very effective way to address bug reports and questions. So when it comes to the very unfortunate event of your game already getting a lot of negative reviews, I think that the best thing you can do is to interact with players more proactively because it sends out the message that you are actively listening and collecting feedback, which is a huge plus in any case. And this is especially true for developers from outside of China, because if you make the effort to overcome language barrier to interact with Chinese players, this will genuinely mean a lot to them. And I also said earlier that a lot of Chinese players would use Steam reviews as a way to report bugs. So this means that if you let them know that the bug in question is fixed, they are usually very quick to change their reviews back to positive. And I also think that using machine translation for replying to Steam reviews is not a big problem. So as long as you're being transparent about this, I don't think there's any need to worry about translation errors because from my experience, majority of the services are actually quite reliable. So for the last part of my talk today, I would like to also briefly talk about marketing games beyond the boundaries of Steam. So let's take a quick look at the main channels for games marketing in China. So with videos and streams, we have Bilibili, which is a similar to YouTube, and Douyin, which is the Chinese TikTok. And so both of these platforms have a lot of active gaming content creators, and these platforms are the most popular channels for games marketing. As for media, so most games media nowadays would use social platforms as their main outlets. So they mostly post through Weibo, which is Chinese Twitter, and WeChat, which is a very weird hybrid of messaging app and social media. And many of them also have their own websites. And China also has a few other channels for gaming. So here I listed Heybox, which is a pretty popular mobile app for the Steam gaming community, where they can read about news and discounts, and Jump, which is a similar app but with a focus on Nintendo Switch and console games. So the most common way to work with these platforms is to buy paid placements on the apps, which is similar to how websites work in the West, I would say. So although the basics of doing marketing in China is pretty similar to the rest of the world, which mostly also involves influencers, PR, and sometimes ads, but because it involves so many Chinese platforms, I personally think it will be very challenging to do marketing campaigns in China without some kind of local partners. Here I listed two major ways to do this. So first of all, you can work with a Chinese publisher, um, and they will usually pay you a small amount of MG, and they will take care of localization, marketing, and community support in China. And in return, they would normally ask for a rev share. This worked quite well for a lot of indie games, especially games with very small teams. But I would say that the biggest risk is that it will definitely make your business term more complicated, especially if you already have a global publisher. So having to do rev share with another party will definitely impact your income. So another way is to hire a marketing agency in China directly. And there are multiple ways to do this, because I recently also learned that quite a few big PR agencies in Europe and US also have connections in China as well. So this is more of a straightforward approach to how it works globally. You are normally expected to provide a marketing budget, and the agency will handle the execution. like setting up an influencer campaign or reaching out to the media, etc. So I also want to mention that this is also how we currently handle China marketing at TinyBuild. And finally, if you insist on doing DIY, I must say that you're probably choosing the hardcore mode, and I respect you for it. But it's not entirely impossible. So some ideas I can think of, for example, you can consider emailing Chinese influencers, and you can contact the games media as well. And if you do this, I will be very happy to help you, and I'm also very curious to learn about how it works out. And finally, here are some useful resources if you want to dig deeper into the rabbit hole of Chinese games market. So the first one is Game Developers Guide to the Chinese Market, which is a 30-page report by Damien Yakowski of 11-Bit Studios. So this report basically covers almost every single aspect of Chinese games market. And one very interesting fact is that the report is actually sponsored by the Polish embassy in China. So I think it's really cool. And the report includes very detailed first-hand experience and know-how from Damian's marketing practice of 11-bit studio titles. So I especially recommend reading the section about the marketing channels. And he also did a talk at games industry conference, and you can find the video on YouTube. And another resource I recommend is some newsletters from Game Discover Co. So they did a few reports about game discovery mechanics in China and console games market, as well as localization. And usually their newsletters always cover some kind of first-hand experience or case studies from publisher and developers. So I also highly recommend searching this as well. And finally, I'm personally also passionate about Chinese games market industry and culture, even though I am a Chinese person myself. So I also tweet about these topics on my social media. So yeah, feel free to follow me there as well. Yeah, so now we've actually reached the end of the talk. If you have any questions or suggestions about this topic, you can use the contact information here to reach me after the talk. And I also want to mention that although 2024 is a pretty difficult year for the entire games industry, we at Hannibal are still looking for new games design. So please send your pitches to our inbox. And thank you everyone for coming to my talk. And thank you to the add-on organizer for inviting me. And I think we can move on to Q&A.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions?
Hi, thank you. That was really instructive. I had two questions. One is like you mentioned like machine translating. Which softs do you recommend?
Okay, do you mean machine translation?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier.
Oh, okay. So I would be honest, I would say that ChatGPT is pretty decent when it comes to, for example, writing Steam description copies. But when it comes to replying to players, for example, I would say maybe Google Translate is better. Does that answer your question? But
Yeah,
the
thank
issue
you.
is that some terms that Chinese players use can be difficult to translate by machine translation. So you might want to, there could be some misunderstanding if you use those tools to communicate with your players. But in any case, I would encourage you to communicate with them and try to understand each other.
Thank you. Also, I had a second question. It was about censorship. You didn't really talked about this censorship in China regarding certain teams and games.
Ah, that's a very good question. Okay, so, oh, thank you. So this is a little bit of a gray zone, and I wouldn't say what I'm going to say represents the official situation of censorship. So please take what I say with a pinch of salt. So basically, the current situation is that I would say that Steam is a gray zone. So basically, there's no censorship whatsoever on Steam. You can release whatever you want on Steam, but this has always been a concern of the officials banning Steam. But personally, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. But I must be honest. So if your game has some political elements, then the games will be of higher risk of being censored, or I would say being review bombed, because you may know that review bombing is quite a thing for Chinese players.
Thank
Yeah, I
you.
hope that answered your question. Hi. Oh, oh, nice to meet you. Yeah. Okay. I can only speak from my experience as a publisher working with them directly. So majority of the agencies make money from influencer campaigns. So I understand that, for example, for Western agencies, they would usually give you a reference commission. For example, some agency would take 10, 15, 20% from the influencer fees. So this is how Western agencies would make money from influencer campaigns. But for agencies in China, they kind of so I would say the pricing for influencers has more room. So there isn't that much transparency regarding the prices of a single influencer. So for example, if they work with one influencer quite a lot, then maybe they can work with him on a campaign for free, but they can, for example, charge you with certain amount of money. I um, so the difference in pricing is how they make money. I hope this makes sense. But what I want to say is that, for example, the Western agencies would usually charge either a package price or a monthly price for PR support. But I have to say that PR support isn't a thing for Chinese agencies. So it's usually included in your services, but they don't really you are not expected to pay for reaching out to the media. It's a pretty weird structure, but I would say the easiest way to understand is just that you are expected to provide a certain amount of budget. For example, if it's 100K, then they will do something that is worth 100K, and maybe they will make around 10% or 15% from that price. But uh, the problem is you don't really know how much they will make. So I would say maybe it's better to work with someone that your partner recommends. So yeah, this is one of the challenges of working with agencies directly.
Hi,
Hi, thanks for the presentation.
Hi.
question.
Question:
If I
If
were
I
to
were to
teleport in
teleport in
China right
China right
now
now
and
and
spend the
spend
day
the day
with someone
with
who plays
someone who
video
plays video
games,
games,
would that be
would that be
something that
something that
surprises me?
surprises me?
And
And
also,
also,
does the
does the
split
split
between
between
players
players
sharing
sharing
their
their
time
time
equally
equally
between
between
console,
console,
PC, and
PC, and
mobile
mobile
still
still
hold in
hold
China?
in China?
Can you repeat your first question?
If
If
I
I
were to
were to
teleport right
teleport
now
right now
in
in
China and
China and
spend a
spend
day
a
with a
day with a
gamer,
gamer,
would that be
would that be
something that
something that
surprises me?
surprises me?
Honestly, I don't know how to answer that question.
It's okay. It's okay. Just take a second.
Okay. Yeah, I would encourage you to do that if you can. Why not? But yeah, for your second question, yeah, I wanted to talk about it, but because my topic is mostly just Steam, so I didn't include it in my slides. So the Chinese audience, I would say, first and foremost, is predominantly mobile. But but that applies to the more like younger and more casual audiences. So I don't think it's something that we can consider right now. But in terms of PC and consoles, I will make a very rudimentary split that I would say around 70% are PC and 30% are consoles. And this is actually due to a very historical reason. So in the early 2000s, the Chinese government actually had a ban on all consoles. So I would say, if I remember correctly, for almost over 10 years, there's no official or legalized way to purchase any type of console in mainland China. So if you want to acquire a console, you had to buy them from like shady traders who import consoles from Hong Kong and Japan. And because of this, there was never a console gaming culture in China to this day. Although after Nintendo Switch released, for some reason, it actually became quite popular right now. But still comparing to PC, I would say that console gaming is still quite a niche today. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Okay, yeah, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.